From the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, this is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bytes. We're delighted to have a special issue of the journal for issue 32.3 on rating performance tests. This has been guest edited by Professors Folkert Kuiken and Ineke Vedder from the University of Amsterdam. We invited them to join us on Language Testing Bytes to talk about this issue of the journal and to tell us something about the importance of research into rating in performance tests. Welcome to Language Testing Bytes to discuss the special issue on rating performance tests.
Thank you. It has been a great pleasure for us to edit this special issue of language testing on raters' decisions, rating procedures and rating scales.
Well, normally on Language Testing Bytes we just jump straight into the topic, but today I'm going to vary things just a little bit. And this is really for the benefit of other researchers in the field who might be interested in proposing a topic for a special issue themselves and guest editing it. Can you briefly tell us about your experience of being guest editors? Perhaps some of the joys and tribulations of putting together an issue like this with all the papers around a particular theme.
Yes, well, 3 years ago for the ILA conference in Beijing in 2011, we organized a colloquium on rating performance, and after the colloquium we asked the contributors to write down their text, and we submitted a proposal to language testing to ask if language testing would be interested in a special issue on rating, and indeed we were very happy that language testing agreed. And well, we also contacted some other authors to ask their collaboration to this special issue.
Well, yes, and then of course came the hard work. We had to stimulate the authors to deliver their texts on time and to respect the deadlines. We then gave our comments on the text, and the text also have been reviewed by the external reviewers of language testing, which of course has led to some revisions of the text. Well, one of the texts had to be withdrawn, but in the end we are very happy with the results.
Well, thanks for your insights on being guest editors. Let's hope that others will be inspired to come forward with challenging ideas that we can take through to a similarly successful conclusion in the future. But now let's turn to the assessment of performance. In your introductory paper, you state that the focus of this special issue is rater variability. Now, just for the moment, let's not worry why raters might vary in the judgments they make. I'd like to start just with the issue of variability itself. Why do we care whether raters vary when making judgments about the quality of a language performance, say speaking or writing?
Well, let me begin by saying that the Common European Framework of References, which throughout Europe has become the major point of reference of language teaching, has also created a growing interest in language assessment, rating scales and rater behavior. And there is now also a growing number of studies on the way in which different aspects of oral and written L2 performance at different proficiency levels should be assessed. But indeed there is the problem of rater variability.
Yeah, and in language practice in the classroom, the performance of language learners is often rated by teachers. And this of course should be done as good and as objective as possible. It would be unfair if a language learner received a higher mark just because he or she has a more legible handwriting or a nicer voice, for instance. So what language learners all want is that their performance is rated according to the same criteria and to the same standards.
Right, and now we've got that concept quite clear, let's turn to the kind of variability that we can have. One source of variability is between raters. That is, raters will disagree with each other when scoring the same performance. And the other source of variability is within an individual rater. Here the rater's judgment is affected by a range of contextual variables. Can we start with the inter-rater variability? What does the special issue say about the causes of this?
Yes, well, rater variability has been found not to result in systematic changes in rating patterns, as shown also by the studies in this special issue. However, there are differences between raters, and there are several causes for this inter-rater variability. For instance, differences due to rating experience in the case of expert and non-expert raters, the differences in the degree of familiarity of the raters with a rating scale, and also differences in their knowledge of the assessment procedure.
Well, and then of course you have to take account of the amount of training a rater has received prior to the rating. Smith and Hopp, for instance, in this special issue, found that familiarity with accent speeds led to shifts in both absolute and relative ratings and increased variability among raters.
Right, and perhaps now you can explain the causes of the intra-rater variability. I guess the potential causes of this are much more varied and complex.
Well, just as in the case of inter-rater variability, there are also several causes of intra-rater variability. For instance, it may be that raters start with a very high expectation of the performance of L2 learners, but that they notice after having judged several texts that none of the text does meet the high initial expectations of the raters, so that raters become more lenient, so the so-called range effects.
Yeah, and on the other hand, you also have the order effect. Raters have to be very strict and take care that after having rated the performance of 51 learners, that you are rating the performance of the 52nd learner according to the same criteria as the preceding texts. What I do not know is if intra-rater variability is more varied and more complex as the causes of inter-rater variability. In my opinion, it may be as varied and as complex as inter-rater variability.
Much of the research in this special issue is concerned with the relationship between raters' judgments of the quality and accuracy of writing or speaking and the actual quality of the performance when analysed linguistically. Can you tell us what the main findings are in this area? I mean, do raters' views tend to coincide with analyses of actual performance? And what is the implication of what we know in this area for rater training?
Well, in some of the articles in this special issue, correlation coefficients have been calculated between, on the one hand, raters' judgments and on the other hand, measures of actual performance with respect to syntactic complexity, lexical diversity and accuracy. In our own research, for instance, we found that the judgments of the raters correlated significantly with measures of lexical diversity and accuracy, but not with syntactic complexity. So it seems that raters, when judging a written text, for instance, tend to pay more attention to vocabulary and to accuracy than to sentence length and the number of subordinated sentences.
Yes, and in one of the other studies, the chapter by Pinget and colleagues, the authors found that acoustic measures of fluency were good predictors of fluency scores by raters, but that perceived fluency and perceived accent seem to be only weakly related. And what has also become apparent from the literature is that judgments of expert raters do not always coincide with those of non-expert raters. So in this sense, it is always important for raters to practice with some text as models so that they get used to what they are asked to rate.
Of course, rating scales are frequently used to guide raters in coming to judgments. Quite a number of the papers in the special issue are concerned with rating scales and how they're used. What is your take on how raters use rating scales? And are there any kinds of rating scales that you think are particularly useful? Or is it the case that raters simply bring their own interpretative baggage to the process and just kind of ignore the scales?
Well, in our research we found that raters are having the hardest time in judging what they call the in-between texts. So not the texts that are at the bottom or at the top of the scale, but at an intermediate level. And Grandveld and colleagues drew the same conclusion. And sometimes raters also use scale external criteria, such as text length.
Yes, and Huta and colleagues in their study found that the two rating scales which they compared, one rating scale based on the Common European Framework and another Finnish rating scale, were not really different, but raters, however, turned out to be not equally severe, and therefore Huta and colleagues suggest the use of multiple ratings. And Schmid and Hopp in their study found that effects of using different scales were minimal, at least as long as the same reference point for accent rating was preserved. So this means that the use of a reference point seems to be particularly important for raters when using a rating scale.
This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'd like to bring the podcast to an end by asking you about an issue which continues to be problematic for assessment. At the end of your introductory paper, you tantalisingly say that the relationship between the descriptors in rating scales and acquisitional sequences in SLA remains a challenge. Just how big a challenge is this, and is there any kind of solution in sight?
Well, this is indeed a difficult question to answer, and certainly more research is needed. However, in one of the articles of the special issue, an attempt is made in the study of Glanveld and colleagues, for instance. The scale descriptors of the rating scales are linked to 6 stages of morphosyntactic development in French.
Well, thank you very much for guest editing a special issue that raises all kinds of fascinating research issues for performance assessment and rating. And, of course, for joining us on Language Testing Bytes to talk through some of those issues. I'm sure that our listeners will be eagerly reading through the volume after listening to this podcast.
Well, we'd like to thank you for having given us the opportunity for putting up this special issue, and we hope that the readers will enjoy it.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bytes. Language Testing Bytes is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bytes through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So, until next time, we hope you enjoy the current issue of Language Testing.